Two of the biggest icons of 1980s cinema were RoboCop and the Terminator. In the early 90s, these two franchises collided in the realm of comic books, with a 4-part miniseries in 1992 published by Dark Horse Comics, entitled RoboCop vs. the Terminator. Written by Frank Miller and drawn by Walt Simonson, the story showed us an alternate take on the future war between humans and machines. We all know Skynet became self-aware, deemed mankind the enemy, and launched an all-out assault against them. But the comic explains that Cyberdyne Systems had used the technology of RoboCop to create the Skynet CPU. The human side of him, combined with his ability to interface with other machines, is what allowed Skynet to obtain its sentience. A resistant soldier would go back in time and kill RoboCop before Cyberdyne could utilize him. To prevent this from happening, Skynet would send Terminators back to protect RoboCop. Murphy's consciousness would be uploaded into Skynet's network, but he would hide within it, replicating his mind until, several decades into the future, he is able to build himself a new body in a Terminator factory, and later, several more duplicates to take the fight to Skynet. In the end, RoboCop covers himself in a shapeless blob of synthetic flesh and goes back in time to destroy the Cyberdyne satellite in space that would become Skynet and prevent the future depicted in this comic from coming to fruition. The RoboCop vs. the Terminator comic series is a heck of a lot of fun. It finds an effective and entertaining way to merge these two beloved sci-fi universes together. Soon after its conclusion, we would get video games based on it, the two primary ones being on the Super Nintendo in late 1993 and a Sega Genesis version in mid-1994. Both games are side-scrolling run-and-gunners with some platforming hazards and other gimmicks thrown into the mix. They have very satisfying gunplay, some of the best on the consoles, in my honest opinion. You can shoot in several directions and while hanging or climbing ladders. RoboCop does feel a bit weightier in the SNES version. I also think shooting the weapons feels a little slicker. Power-ups can be found in hidden areas in the levels. RoboCop heads give you extra lives, and the shields make RoboCop invulnerable for a few seconds. Your default weapon is RoboCop's machine pistol, the Auto 9. Additional weapons can be picked up though, like a machine gun, missile launcher, a standard one, and one that fires swarming missiles, a flamethrower, bazooka, and in the later stages of the game, set in the future, various plasma weapons that shoot red or white beams. In both games, while battling the Ed 209, you can pick up and use its Gatling gun that gets blown off. I wish RoboCop Rogue City would let you do that. A missed opportunity. The strongest weapon in either game would have to be the plasma rifle in the Genesis version that instantly evaporates enemies. You need to be careful when you pick up new weapons in RoboCop vs. Terminator, because they can overwrite the existing ones in your inventory. When you die, you also lose whatever weapons you have acquired. In the Genesis version especially, this can be a major problem during the boss battles, because some of them are excruciatingly long. They take an eternity. Even with the enhanced weapons, you start wondering if your game is broken with a few of them. Having lengthy boss battles like this doesn't increase a game's replay value. It does the opposite, in my eyes. It can make a game boring. Some of these boss battles just stop being fun. While the bosses are excessively long in the Genesis game, the SNES port isn't without its issues. I find the game to be a lot fucking harder than the one on Genesis. there tends to be a lot more enemies on screen at once due to that classic respawn bullshit that happens if you back away from them too much. The game puts as much emphasis on climbing and platforming as it does on shooting. It focuses a lot on the hanging mechanic, which you will need to master for later parts of the game. Some of the climbing sequences can be agonizing as hell to sit through if you fall. A couple of the levels also have pitfalls you will need to avoid. The only way I could capture the later stages was by using the Infinite Lives Game Genie code. Things got so bad that I had to use an invincibility one too. I just ran out of patience playing through the same sections over and over again. Comparing the visuals and music, both games look and sound great. I think the Sega version does have the darker and grittier style and edge to it. It has blood in it when you take out any of the human enemies, so it has somewhat of a gore factor, at least what would be considered such at the time. I also love the red sky in the Delta City sections, reminding me of the new Batman Adventures. There's a level taking place in a toxic farm that has you navigating around and over vats of toxic waste. The outposts in the future war levels feel dismal, with the ruins of buildings and the fires inside of TV sets. I like the visuals in the SNES version too, though. They have their own unique charm. You can see bolts of lightning crackling in the skies of Delta City. There are piles of human skulls in the foreground of the future levels. I love the T-800s that break out of those activation pods. The final boss, the Skynet CPU, is also far more visually interesting and creative on Nintendo than it is on Sega. It's a face in the form of an electrical current that changes color from blue to green to pink to red. The Skynet CPU in the Genesis version is just a large T-800 head, which is pretty lame. The boss encounters in each of the games have been rearranged or replaced altogether. In the Genesis version, you encounter your first T-800 wearing synthetic skin sooner than in the SNES one, on the streets of Detroit instead of at the construction sites. Ed 209 fights you in the streets as well on the Super Nintendo, whereas in the Genesis game, it fights you in the main office of OCP. There's a battle with RoboCop 2, as well as some sort of Skynet Walker, which are both exclusives to the Genesis, and one against an HK tank and floating Terminator drone, which are exclusives to the Super Nintendo. Like I said at the start, the RoboCop vs. Terminator games are based on the comic book series from the early 1990s. The first half of the levels in them take place during the early part of the 90s, whereas the last half are set decades into the future. The SNES version blows its Genesis competition out of the water in regards to the story element. The Sega port only has scrolling text at the beginning and end of it, whereas the one on Super Nintendo makes use of cutscenes in the form of comic book panels. It tries to adapt the events of the source comic as best it can. These cutscenes provide the player with a lot more context between stages. I will say, though, a few can be quite painful to sit through with how slowly they move through each panel, and with the limited words that can fit in each text bubble that pops up. They can take a bit too long to get their point across. I'm conflicted when choosing which version of RoboCop vs. Terminator is better. I think they both have their own strengths and weaknesses. Overall, I'd say the Genesis port is more enjoyable to play despite its lengthy boss battles. The SNES version can get really challenging and cheap in the last half. I had to resort to heavy cheating, but without question, it is the far greater adaptation of the story of the comic book. If you've played them, let me know your thoughts on the RoboCop vs. Terminator games down in the comments section below. I want to thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed my review. Show your support for my channel by subscribing, sharing my videos, clicking those like buttons, and by becoming a producer over on Patreon if you can. I will see you all in the next one. Take care and stay nerdy.